I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Welcome to Week 3 of the Military Records Deep Dive. As I finished up last week's episode on the War of 1812, it dawned on me that perhaps I was assuming a bit of background knowledge that not everyone has. So before we get too much further, I wanted to talk a little bit about the structures and organizations of the Army, the nation's principal warfighting force, which can maybe provide a bit more comfort when dealing with some of the documents generated by the Army. It's a bit of a tribe, and it's got its own language. It's fairly easy to understand if you do a bit of reading, but at first glance, it can seem confusing. So, before jumping into the resources for your Mexican War ancestor, let's just talk Army. Last week, I provided a bit of an overview of the Army between the Revolution and the War of 1812, and I talked about the stovepiping of military capability. The early Army capabilities were infantry, light infantry, cavalry, dragoons, artillery, and light artillery. I think we all probably intuitively understand that infantry are the people who generally walk around on foot with muskets or rifles, and in battle stood in long line formations and took turns shooting at each other. They are the bread and butter of the Army and do most of the fighting and the dying in battle. They're known as the Queen of Battle because, just like the queen on the chessboard, the infantry is dominant. But what is light infantry in the context of 18th and 19th century warfare? Light infantry units were also men who largely walked around everywhere they went and carried muskets or rifles, although more commonly rifles. But they did not fight in long line formation, trading blows with the enemy. Instead, the light infantry was usually placed ahead of your force as you moved, and they took up sparse formations covering large amounts of terrain. They carried little equipment, allowing the pack trains of the main body of the Army to transport the bulk of their life support. This allowed them to move quickly over rough terrain and provide early warning when in close range to enemy forces. During battle, they were often used to maneuver on enemy flanks or their sides. Their relatively small numbers and how they operated meant that they didn't usually go toe-to-toe with the enemy, although, out of the need for surprise or survival, sometimes they would. Cavalry, again, would seem fairly obvious. These are the folks on horseback. But the function of cavalry changes over this time period, and the U.S. Army doesn't really go the route of European armies in developing heavy and light cavalry forces. That won't come until later, until the tank. European forces liked to use cavalry as a hammer that struck directly at units and could be decisive in a tactical sense on the battlefield. These were the heavy cavalry. I think that partly because of the uniqueness of American terrain, paired with the fact that our nation was born into the firearms era, we never really looked at attack as the primary role of cavalry. Instead, cavalry were the eyes and the ears of the Army. They would move quickly, getting close to enemy forces to make estimates of their size and intentions, and then quickly disengage and report back to their command. They have certainly been used on the battlefield to great effect, but often in a protective sense. When used offensively, they did their best work when engaging in raids, quick shock attacks followed by a withdrawal to preserve their forces. While soldiers on horseback have an impressive impact on the battlefield initially, they aren't great in a sustained fight. Think of them as professional drive-by soldiers. So what are the dragoons? Well, that topic can get a bit muddy over the years, but doctrinally, the dragoons were cavalry that fought like infantry, or more properly, light infantry. They used their horses for increased mobility, but would dismount when it was time for a fight. They would often use carbines or shortened versions of long guns suited for horseback. By the end of the 19th century, the term dragoon had mostly gone by the wayside, and they were referred to instead as mounted infantry. The artillery are, again, probably a pretty obvious organization. They were the ones with the big guns. But in the 18th and 19th century, artillery was really a fundamentally different battlefield effect than it is today. Modern American howitzers have max ranges of 7 to 25 miles and are fired indirectly. You shoot it up in the air, and the projectile lands well beyond line of sight. In the 18th and 19th centuries, while they did have some pieces that fired indirectly, they were mostly firing cannons in direct fire, that is, more or less level with the ground, aimed directly at your intended target. They could fire a wide range of projectiles, and when things got really dire, they could shoot just about everything up to and including the kitchen sink. Around this time period, artillery began to be known as the king of battle, as opposed to the infantry's queen. I like to think that it's because they were jealous and they wanted a cool-sounding nickname for themselves, but it's really kind of silly, right? Like, the king is the most useless piece on the board. One accurate comparison with its chess counterpart, though, is that the whole purpose is to take your opponent's king. Well, in the battlefields of the 18th and 19th centuries, taking your opponent's artillery was a major focal point. Well, at least in the 18th century it was. Through the 19th century, ranges and accuracy had drastically increased the lethality, so artillery wasn't taken as often as it was fired upon by opposing artillery in an attempt to take it out. But either way, the king of battle was the number one target on the battlefield. But what about light artillery? Well, the size of the guns and horses were the main difference. Light artillery often used smaller guns that could move a little more quickly, and the entire battery was mounted. Both artillery and light artillery had lots of horses, but artillery used their horses for moving the guns and the officers. Everyone else usually walked. With light artillery, typically everyone was mounted, and these units were often organized along with cavalry units. By the time of the American Civil War, Federal light artillery units were often armed with rifled guns that had exceptional range. The organizations of the Army are another good area to become familiar with as you dig into your military research. The first two organizations that you're likely to encounter are the company and the regiment. You will usually find this right at the top of compiled service records if you can find them. The smallest unit of organization during this time was the squad, although this unit and its next larger unit, the platoon, didn't really possess much of an identity. They were mostly useful in maintaining administrative control of the unit. The company is really the first level of military organization that had an identity, so to speak. Usually, in the American Army, men from a single company would typically come from the same county or set of neighboring counties. Sometimes they had a pre-war identity as a standalone militia organization, although that really depends on the time period you're looking at and the specific unit. Oftentimes, if they did have an identity separate from being, say, Company H, you'll find that referenced on the compiled service records or in the unit records if you find them. So it may say something like Company H and in parentheses, Fayetteville Independent Light Infantry. That can give you a hint that there might be some other places that you can go looking for records. As an aside, the Fayetteville Independent Light Infantry, organized in 1793, and they still exist, or at least they did the last time I was there, talk about living history. Companies are generally an infantry organization, with the artillery equivalent called batteries. You might occasionally see the cavalry companies referred to as troops, but for the most part during this period, they're called companies as well. The troop terminology change doesn't make a full takeover until the 1880s. Several companies would typically make up a regiment. The sizes of these levels of organization varied over the time period from the Revolutionary War through the Mexican War, though companies generally consisted of about 50 men, and regiments usually had 10 companies for about 500 men total. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but it's pretty typical. By the Civil War, these sizes had changed somewhat, with companies being about 100 men at full strength, and regiments ran about 1,000 men strong. Sometimes you'll see an organization level of battalion. Just generally think of this as being the same as regiment, although it's not really true. Typically, battalions were ad hoc subunits of regiments, but you'll see the terms intermixed frequently. Either way, both consisted of multiple companies. From there, groups of regiments were organized into brigades, which was for the most part the largest meaningful organization on early American battlefields. By the Civil War, we get into much larger organizations, but we can talk about those later. That's probably enough Army talk for now. I might cover some more generic Army information in future episodes, but let's get into what's out there that you can find for your Mexican War ancestor. Like with last week, the Mexican War was an Army war rather than an American war. Only about 0.3% of the American population served in the war. Although few Americans could probably tell you very much about the Mexican War, it absolutely altered the course of our history. If you live anywhere in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, or parts of Wyoming and Colorado, you're an American because of the Mexican War. It's got to rank pretty high in the panoply of wars in world history in terms of the amount of land transferred as a result of the war. The war saw a number of firsts, as the first American war with no actual militia units serving, There were, of course, thousands of militiamen who served, but they served in federalized volunteer regiments, making them more a part of the actual army than the militia of the War of 1812 or the American Revolution. It was also the first and only war that saw a service from a religious regiment. The Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints fielded the Mormon Battalion. An interesting tidbit made only more interesting by the fact that their only major battle occurred in the winter of 1846 when they fought fiercely against a herd of wild bulls along the San Pedro River just east of modern-day Sierra Vista, Arizona. They lost a number of their mules, but killed 9 bulls in retaliation. The war was predominantly led by inexperienced adventurers, much like the War of 1812, but one man emerged as a professional amongst amateurs. The famous Winfield Scott, veteran of the War of 1812, would lead the successful campaign from the landings in Veracruz to the capturing of Mexico City. He would go on to serve as the senior officer in the Army until his retirement, almost 7 months after the start of the Civil War. Ultimately, he served in the Army from 1808 to 1861, and I'm not sure of anyone else whose uniformed service spanned a longer period of time. As you start looking for information about your Mexican War ancestor, a surprisingly good place to start is the United States National Park Service. They maintain a U.S. Mexican War soldiers and sailors database, with an index of over 89,000 American and 700 Mexican soldiers and sailors. While this is only a small percentage of Mexican soldiers, this database accounts for almost 80% of American service members, so chances are, if you had an ancestor who served, they're likely in that database. You won't find a ton of information there, but you'll get some important bits like what regiment they served in, and in some cases what company. Although not common, I have seen a number of records that also show the birthplace, which can be a great way of identifying the right person if your ancestor had a common name. Once you've identified what regiment your ancestor served in, you'll be wanting to find their compiled service records. Again, as was the case with the War of 1812, while you can search indexes for the service records at places like Family Search, you won't be finding many online collections of compiled service records. There are a few online collections that you can access at places like Family Search, Ancestry, and Fold3. You'll be limited to soldiers in volunteer regiments from Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Texas, and the Mormon Battalion. This is, of course, great if that covers your ancestor, but frustrating if it doesn't. For the rest of us, we'll have to go to the National Archives. Again, ordering service records from the National Archives is surprisingly easy and can be done through their website. If you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C. and visit the archives in person, you can actually get your hands on the real thing. I've never done that, but I think that would be a pretty cool experience. While you're there, don't leave without looking at a number of other resources available there, like the Mexican War Hospital records, registers of officers arriving at Veracruz, or the registers of Mexican War applications for regular Army commissions. For regular Army soldiers, you still always have the Army's Register of Enlistments 1798 to 1914, which is available at a number of places online. Again, it's not as useful as compiled service records, but it does have more information than any index is likely to have. As for pension records, I might sound like a bit of a broken record, but again, your best bet is with the National Archives. There's a pension index for 1887 to 1926 that you might be able to find some basic information, but beyond that, you'll need to hit the archives. But again, don't be afraid, because if you don't look, you'll be missing accounts of their wartime experiences, accounts from their fellow soldiers, family information, and information about where they lived after the war. It's a lot of good stuff. For bounty land records, I'm not really sure where to send you. Service members from the Mexican War were eligible for bounty lands based on the Act of February 1847 and additional acts in 1850, 1852, and again in 1855. I've never seen anything with regards to online records of bounty land warrants. Your best bet is to look in the archive pension records, or perhaps Record Group 49, which is Bureau of Land Management records, or possibly Records Group 15, which is records of the Veterans Administration. I'll have to admit, this is kind of a gap in my swing. There are a number of sources for unit histories from just about every state that volunteer regiments came from. I'll include a link to a Family Search wiki page listing all those sources. Remember, if you find one, look for it on WorldCat, and you may find a library that would be willing to do an interlibrary loan to a local library where you can get your hands on it without having to travel across the country. If you've never done an interlibrary loan before, just call your librarian and ask. They'll be happy to help. These unit histories are great for filling in some of the so what once you've found what regiment your ancestor served in. There just isn't a tremendous wealth of readily available information about specific unit actions during this war. So a unit history will be a bit of a goldmine for you. At the end of the day, I ended up talking a lot more about generic Army information than I did about the Mexican War, and I'm sorry for that, but it's just one of those areas that will be difficult for beginners because there's so little available on your big genealogy websites. In fact, if you're able to find a good bit of information about your Mexican War ancestor, you may have graduated from the beginner genealogist title, and you're probably well into the intermediate range. If you're still at that beginner level, though, but you know you have a Mexican War ancestor, this is a great place to work on those research muscles and expand your skills. If you've ever successfully researched a Mexican War relative, I'd love to hear about it. Reach out to me on Twitter @TheWGTPod. Next week, we'll be tearing our country apart and putting it back together again. The Civil War is a monster to research because there's just so much out there. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.